welcome back to my channel. Today I'm doing my April wrap-up. So first of all, in case anyone was wondering, I was able to complete my April TBR. I wasn't sure that I would, as you would have seen in my May TBR if you watched that. But I did, just barely, but still. I was able to read a total of 9 books in April, which I feel like is pretty consistent for me. It's pretty much the same or around the same number of books that I finished in the previous months this year. So let's just go through all the books that I've read this month, starting with the books that was on my Bookish Bingo TBR. So the first prompt that the Bookish Bingo gave me was to read a book with a one-word title. For this prompt I read Politi by Jo Nesbø. This is the 10th book in the Harry Hole series. I ended up liking this book more than the previous book in the series. The previous book in the series was probably one of my least favorites, actually. It was about drugs and just like drug trade and things like that, and it's just not something that I'm particularly interested in, so I didn't really care that much for that book. This one, on the other hand, I thought was a lot better. So in this one there's basically a serial killer who is killing people in the police who have previously been involved in investigating unsolved murders, which is all I really want to say about the plot. This books, or this series, it's pretty dark and gritty. There is quite a bit of violence in here. Not so much that you're seeing the violence happening on page, it's more the fact that like most of the murders are pretty violent. And yes, you know, there tends to be pretty detailed descriptions of the murders in these books. So just be aware of that if you are interested in the series. I mainly like these books because there tends to be the mysteries in here tends to be pretty good, and also because the setting in these books are familiar to me. These books, most of them anyway, are set in Oslo. I have lived in Oslo. I am pretty familiar with that city, so you know I can picture the streets and all the places that are mentioned in here. So I like it for that reason. The Oslo that is described in these books are a lot darker than the Oslo that I know, but I guess that's just the mood of these books. There was one event that happened in here that I kind of hated, to be honest. But apart from that, I actually enjoyed this one. So I think I would probably give it 4 stars. I just overall like this series, even though it's a little bit up and down, but like overall this is a series that I enjoy. The next prompt that the Bookish Bingo gave me was to read a book by a female author. For this prompt I read Strange the Dreamer by Laini Taylor. I actually didn't know a whole lot about this book going in. I mainly knew that it was about a guy named Laszlo Strange and that it was about a lost city. That was pretty much it. And I would actually recommend going into this series knowing as little as possible, because there was just a lot more to this than I expected, and it was just fun to discover all of that. We get 2 point of views in this book, and through those point of views we basically get to see like different sides to the main conflict in here. And I really enjoy that because, you know, you just get to see that things are not black and white. It's just a lot more complicated than that. The ending of this one was a huge surprise. I did not see that coming at all. And now I'm just like very, very curious to see what will happen in the next book, which is, you know, the final book in this duology. Because yeah, things could get pretty interesting, I think, without going into spoilers. Laini Taylor, I think I've mentioned before, she has a very distinct writing style. It's very beautiful. I really like her writing. It's very flowery, I want to say. But while it is very beautiful, it also feels like a lot sometimes. Like I don't think I could read like a lot of Laini Taylor books in a row, if that makes sense. Like, I think that would be just a little bit too much of this type of style. And there is a romance in here, and I didn't mind that romance at all. But just with this type of writing style, it just maybe felt a little bit over the top at times, and I felt like it took up a lot of space. And in this book, I was mainly just interested in the main conflict, so I was just like, can we please go back to the conflict, because that's what I'm interested in reading about. So I guess that was kind of my main complaint about this, even though it didn't like bother me too much. Overall, this was a very good book. I really enjoyed it. Laini Taylor, she has a way of just mixing, you know, something that is very beautiful with something that is very brutal, so to speak. I felt like she did that in the Daughter of Smoke and Bone series, and she did that in this as well. And it's a mix that I find that I really like. So overall, this was very good. I would probably give it 4 stars. It wasn't quite up there for me, but it is a very good book. And if this sounds in any way interesting to you, I would suggest picking it up. The next prompt that the Bookish Bingo gave me was to read an audiobook. And for this prompt, I decided to read The Magicians Nephew, which is the 6th book, or at least for me, it's the 6th book in the Narnia series. And I mentioned in my TBR that I wanted to try and get to the final book as well, book number 7 in this. And I was able to read that one as well. That one is called The Last Battle. So I read 2 books in this. Book number 6 that I read first is called The Magician's Nephew. It's chronologically the first book in the series, and it's in this edition, it's the first one in here as well. So that one sort of tells the story of the beginning of Narnia, so to speak. We meet 2 children, Polly and Diggory, and they are sort of being sent into a different world by Diggory's uncle, who thinks that he is a magician. So I actually quite enjoyed that book. It was a lot of fun. I felt like the world was even more expanded on, and we got some explanations maybe about things that happens later in the series. So for that reason, it was fun to have already read most of the later books. The other book that I read, The Last Battle, I didn't really care for that one, to be honest. It's kind of hard to pinpoint exactly why, but I think like obviously going into these books, I know that there are going to be religious aspects or parallels, or you know, whatever you want to call it. I think that's pretty well known. And I feel like in some books in this series, those parallels just haven't been super obvious, or at least I haven't noticed them that much. But in The Last Battle and also in The Magician's Nephew, I think those aspects were just very obvious. And I think to me, as a non-religious reader, it just felt like a little bit too much maybe. And that goes for both of the books that I read this month, even though I didn't mind it so much in The Magician's Nephew. But yeah, I completed the series. I'm very happy about it because it's been a long journey. I have been reading this for a very long time, and I'm happy to finally have finished it. It's definitely been an experience with some ups and downs. I haven't enjoyed all the books, but I have enjoyed some. For the last 2 books that I read, I would probably give The Magician's Nephew maybe 3 stars and The Last Battle 2 stars, I think. But yeah, I'm finally finished the series and I'm very happy about it. The next prompt that I got for my Bookish Bingo was to read a historical fiction or a classic. And for this prompt, I read Tin Man by Sarah Winman. This is also the book that I picked out when I did the Quick to Judge challenge. So this book is a little difficult to explain, but we're meeting 2 main characters in here. There is Alice and there is Michael. And the 2 of them, they used to be best friends, super close friends when they were teenagers. And now they are adults, and we're kind of just seeing like where life has taken them and how the relationship have changed since they were young. I guess that's it's a very simple explanation, but you know, it's the best I can give, I think, without going into spoilers. This book takes place between 1950 and sometime in the 90s. It's mainly taking place in the 60s, 70s and 80s. I wasn't sure when I put this on my TBR if it would work for the historical fiction prompt, but I would say that it does. I would put this in the historical fiction genre. It actually goes back and forth in time a lot, but it's done very seamlessly, and I actually really enjoyed that. I mentioned in a vlog that I did that this book wasn't quite what I expected, which makes sense in a way because, you know, I didn't really know what to expect from this book. I didn't really know what it was. I couldn't remember why I had bought it several years ago now. But I think the main reason I felt like that was just because this was just a lot sadder than I expected. It started off very sad. Alice, in the beginning of the story, has basically he's lost his wife in a car accident. That is being told in some of the very first pages, so I don't think that's a spoiler. So it starts off very sad, and it just gets worse, basically. This is a very beautiful book. The writing is beautiful, almost kind of poetic, I want to say. And there are some really wonderful relationships in here. It's also a very quiet book. There isn't a whole lot going on apart from, you know, just the characters' lives. I really enjoyed this, especially the parts where we went back in time and just learned more about the characters' lives. But there were also some parts in here that I found quite boring and I just didn't care that much for. I also found that the writing, while it was very beautiful, it was maybe not quite my thing. It was just maybe a little bit too poetic for me, and it kind of lost me a little at times because of that. So yeah, I have been going back and forth a little bit on my rating on this because, you know, I definitely really liked some parts of it, and then there were others I liked less, but I think I would give this one maybe 3.5 stars. It was good, and I would definitely recommend it if this sounds interesting to you. I think the things that I didn't quite like about this book was more a me thing than anything that I can fault the book for, you know. So I do think that this is a really good book. There was just some things about the writing style and some other things as well that just wasn't quite there for me, but still a very good book that I would recommend if this sounds interesting to you. And the final prompt on my bookish bingo TBR was to read a book with a person or people on the cover. And for this prompt, I read First Impressions by C. Kaler. This is an arc that I got from NetGalley. So in this one, we have our two main characters, Cameron and Henry, and they meet at a party where they're sort of set up by their friends. And just neither of them is very happy about it or even really wants to be there. And because of that, they just end up getting terrible first impressions of each other, even though they both feel some attraction towards each other as well. And over the next couple of months, they keep running into each other and seeing each other, but they're both like very hung up on that first impression that they got and are just determined not to like the other person, basically. So I saw some people, after I'd read this book, I saw some people on Goodreads mentioning that this is kind of a Pride and Prejudice adaptation, retelling of some kind, which I didn't think about at the time that I was reading this, but I can definitely see in hindsight. Unfortunately, I didn't like this book, which I am so sad about because it sounded like something that I could really enjoy. This, you know, I thought this was a romance, and I guess technically it is a romance, but there's just very little romance in here. Barely anything at all, I want to say. Apart from the very brief moments that Cameron and Henry see each other when they run into each other, this book is mainly just about them living their everyday lives with, you know, friends and family. And there is a lot going on happening in their lives involving their friends and family, but I didn't really care about any of the characters in this, the main characters or the side characters. So for me, those parts just got very boring and I just didn't care for them. There was also supposed to be a lot of humor in this book, and I mean there was, but the humor just, it didn't work for me. It was just lost on me, and some of the things that I am pretty sure was supposed to be funny just felt pretty ridiculous to me. There was also just like a weird mix, like obviously with the way the romance was built up, it felt very slow burn. But at the same time, it also felt very insta-lovey, because when things finally happened towards the end, it just happened way too quickly. And it just didn't make sense, and it just felt so insta-lovey that this book just didn't work for me, unfortunately. I am sad about it, like I said. I really wanted to like this, but it just wasn't for me. The only thing that really kept me going through this book was the romance, because I was interested in seeing what would happen between Henry and Cameron. But in the end, even that just left me pretty unsatisfied, basically. So yeah, I'm not 100% sure on my rating for this book. It's either a 2-star or lower. Like, I can't give it more than that, unfortunately. So yeah, I'm sad, but this book just didn't work for me. So that was my bookish bingo, TBR, or the books that I read for those prompts. So let's move on to the other books that I read this month. The first of those were The House on the Cerulean Sea by T.J. Klune. This was my buddy read with Liz, and I'm happy to say that we both ended up loving this book. So in this book we're meeting Linus Baker, and he works for the department in charge of magical youth, and he is very dedicated to his job. He really cares about the children that he meets in his job, but he also really cares about following the rules and regulations and just making sure that everything is correct. And one day he gets a very special assignment. He is asked to go to a very special orphanage out on an island by the sea. The children that lives in this orphanage are supposed to be very dangerous. And Linus, he is a little hesitant and nervous about this assignment, but he always cares about helping children. And he also always wants to do what's expected of him, so he goes to this island. And out on this island he meets the 6 children who lives there, and he also meets the mysterious Arthur, who is the master of the orphanage, and who does eventually catch Linus's interest in more ways than one, maybe. So this book was just wonderful. The kids in this book, they are amazing. I mean, Linus, he is definitely our favorite characters, but I want to say that the kids in this book, they are pretty much the heart of the story, I want to say. They all have their own very distinct personalities. They are all so much fun, and you just can't help but care about them so much. But Linus, he is also a very wonderful main character. At the beginning of this book, his life is very limited. He has his job, which he is very dedicated to, even though the work environment is pretty awful, to say the least. But apart from his job, he basically only cares about his cat and listening to old records. So just by going to this island, he is very much stepping outside of his comfort zone. And I think that is definitely one of the major themes of this book as well, that if you are willing to step out of your comfort zone, a whole new world might open up to you. So yeah, this book was just very special. I don't know if I've ever read a book quite like this one. The universe that we are introduced to in the beginning feels very bleak, but this book is just so heartwarming that you almost forget that. This book is very much about found families, which is definitely something that I love in books. And this just gave me all the feels, basically. I loved the characters. I loved the overall message of this book. And I just loved everything that went on in here, basically. It was just wonderful and lovely and whimsical. And the people who have said that this book feels like a warm hug, yes, it definitely does. This was just wonderful and I loved it. I would give it 5 stars. And if you haven't picked up this book yet, and if this sounds in any way like something that is interesting to you, then go pick this up. You will not regret it. It is absolutely wonderful. I am already looking forward to a time that I can reread this one. So highly recommend. Then I read Persuasion by Jane Austen. This one I read for my Persuasion reading vlog / tag. So I already made a whole video about this book where I talked about it a lot, so I am not really going to talk about this book here. I'm just going to mention that I really enjoyed this book. This is my 4th Jane Austen, and I ended up enjoying this one maybe even more than I thought I would. I'm not sure how I would rank this, you know, in comparison to the other Jane Austen books that I've read, because it's been a while since I read some of them. But this one is pretty close to the top, I think. I really enjoyed it. I think I would give this 4 stars, which is a very good rating for me for a classic. So yeah, reading this one was a very good experience, and I'm very happy that the Persuasion tag kind of made me read this, because this was a good book. And the final book that I read in April was A Woman Is No Man by Itaf Rum. This is the very final book that I finished. I finished it just in time. So in this book we're following 3 generations of women, Palestinian American women, I guess. So we have 18-year-old Deya, who is starting to meet with suitors set up by her grandmother Farida. Deya, she doesn't particularly want to get married. She wants to go to college instead, but her grandparents insists that she has to meet with suitor and eventually get married. And in another storyline we're following Deja's mother Isra as she leaves Palestine as a teenager to go marry a man in America. She is also not very eager to get married, but she doesn't really have much of a choice. It's what's expected of her as a woman. A woman's job is basically to get married and have children, preferably boys. So through this book we're alternating between following Deja's and Isra's storylines. And eventually we also get Farida's point of view, Farida, who is Deja's grandmother and Isra's mother-in-law. So I actually really enjoyed this one, even though it was a lot darker and hard-hitting than I expected. The way that women is treated in this were so wrong and unfair and upsetting, and just made me incredibly angry. I found Isra's storyline in particular hard to read just because of the way that she is taught to think about herself and all the shame that she's feeling. It was just really upsetting to read. I saw some people critiquing this book on Goodreads, saying that it lacked nuance. And I guess I can see what they mean and even agree with that a little. But I think it's important when reading this story to remember that this is one story and it doesn't represent, you know, everyone or a whole community or a group of people. My main complaint about this book is mainly that it just started to feel very repetitive after a while. It was just a lot of the same, and in particular in Isra's storyline I felt like. So yeah, that was something that I definitely felt after a while, but overall I liked this book. I think I would give it 3.5 stars. Not quite up there, but still a very good book in my opinion. So these are the physical books that I read in April, and then I also read some of this one, even though I read these on audio. So it's definitely a very physical book heavy month for me. I found that this year I've read a lot more ebooks than I normally do, but this month was definitely the month of physical books, which is very good for my physical TBR, since I'm trying to get that down a little bit. So overall a good reading month. I had some books that I really liked and some books that I did not like, so my ratings were kind of all over the place. But since I had, you know, a 5-star read, which doesn't happen every month, I am still very happy with this reading month. But yeah, that's going to be it for this video. Thank you so much for watching, and I will see you soon with another video. Bye!